agreed to. And I call the member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Higher Education Support Amendment Cost Recovery Bill 2019, the Higher Education Support Changes Bill 2019 and the amendment moved by the member for Moreton. This legislation will allow the government to impose fees on universities for the administration of students' access to the Higher Education Loan Program. These changes are expected to save the Commonwealth just $11 million across the Ford estimates. If they want a suggestion of what to do with that $11 million, I suggest they use it to fund the Captel handsets program that they're closing in February of next year. These are relatively modest savings. The Labor Party will not oppose these bills, but I'll be honest, in this place I do feel uncomfortable supporting this legislation. I spent my life as a student activist campaigning for free education. I'm a passionate believer that you should have the most accessible education system possible, from the earliest years of early childhood education all the way through to lifelong learning. Sadly, here in Australia we have the 6th highest fees for tertiary education in the OECD, the 6th highest fees. That is completely unacceptable. Education is the most transformative investment we make in our people. It's something that we should do with pride, and we should look at ways to put more money into our university sector, not just do small cost recovery matters here and there. I served on the Curtin University Council in 2005 when that university implemented fee deregulation and increases to HECS fees. Sadly, that deregulation and those increases in university fees have continued year after year. Australia's higher education system has become unaffordable for far too many. Some 15 years on from when I was at university, my brother Joey is now studying at the University of Western Australia. He is studying the hard sciences of biology. I only did the soft sciences of social science. My brother Joey has paid twice for his degree, for his undergraduate degree. He has paid twice what I paid. That is completely unacceptable. In another 15 years, my son Leo will be looking at his options for further study, as I hope he is towards completing high school. I am really worried that the sort of system that we continue to defund, continue to increase fees for, will be an even more inaccessible system than the one we have today. By the government's own admission, this is low-priority legislation. It's low-priority legislation also because we have a more serious vocational education and training and skills crisis in this country. I know the TAFEs in my electorate of Perth are crying out for more investment in capital infrastructure, in new modern classrooms, in the facilities they need to teach everything from training the next generation of aged care workers to training the next camos for Channel 7, 9 or 10, or indeed the public broadcasters, the ABC and SBS, training people in how to work in fashion design, training those who work in our labs, and they don't have the facilities that they need in TAFE. And so, again, the government admits this is low-priority legislation, but when it comes to TAFE and vocational education, there are huge, urgent priorities. In just 6 years since this government was elected, we have 140,000 fewer apprentices than we did when the government was elected in 2013. There has been $3 billion cut out of vocational education. We've seen a decline in enrolments in vocational education over those 6 years. In fact, if you look at TAFE enrolments, 2013 to 2019, there are 24.5% fewer TAFE enrolments than when this government was elected. That's a pretty remarkable record for 6 years in government, and one that I would be absolutely ashamed of if I was on the other benches. Labor has other concerns in respect to this legislation. It's about the concerns the member for Moreton has just outlined. The government's approach to the funding of the Australian higher education system is, in my view, mean, and it doesn't actually appreciate the important role of our universities in making sure they can generate that next generation of academics and of people in our workforce. They should be hubs of learning, research, innovation. I'm lucky to have the Edith Cowan University in my electorate, a growing presence of Curtin University. The University of Western Australia is just across the road, and Perth is also experiencing what has been described as a mini-boom of construction of new inner-city student accommodation, something that is bringing much-needed life back into the heart of Perth. Universities broaden minds, they create new possibilities, they create the next Australian discoveries that we can be proud of. I love being at university. Loved it so much I went and did 3 degrees. Our universities are a fabulous place for people to learn, to meet other people and to continue to contribute to the Australian economy. I did spend some time at university, probably won't surprise anyone here, protesting against some of the changes of the Howard government. I won't recreate the chants that we used to use, but eventually Johnny Howard did indeed go. I'm worried that these fees may be passed on to students. I spent in that time not just fighting against increases to higher education contribution schemes, I spent time fighting against parking fee increases and fee increases for the university gymnasium and other things. But I worry that these fees might get passed on to students. That situation would be unacceptable. And we know that even if these fees aren't directly passed on to students, the cost will be paid somewhere. It will come in reduced teaching and learning investment. It will come in decreased investment in equipment for students, or just in the never-ending deregulation of the long-term academic workforce that we rely upon. Also, while students continue to pay that little bit more and that little bit more for their education, we see that they're actually having to start repaying their HECS fees earlier and earlier. Commencing on 1 July this year, people earning $45,000 are now required to begin repaying their help debt. This is for both graduates and those who are still completing their studies. And while they're being asked to repay those debts, students are under huge financial pressure. The Universities Australia conducted a survey in 2017, which was then released in 2018, talking about the finances of students, talking about how they actually manage their day-to-day expenses. And it's very relevant for this debate, because ultimately we're talking about how do students afford their education, and how do we, as a Commonwealth, as a federal parliament, make sure that that education is properly funded. 1 in 7 students in this survey reported going without food and other necessities just so that they could continue, or as they were continuing their studies. The survey showed that for Indigenous students, that was 1 in 4 Indigenous students were going without food or other necessities while they were in a higher education institution. 3 out of 5 students said that their finances were a source of worry and anxiety. That was even higher amongst low SES students, and higher again, most anxiety and source of worry for students' finances came from regional students. Indeed, if you are having to move away from home, costs of being in a student accommodation, everything else that comes with being a regional student going to a campus that might not be in your hometown, and then you're still having to worry about your own personal finances. We then found, the survey also found 1 in 10 students were deferring their studies because of financial pressures, and 2 in 5 students said that their paid work was adversely affected. Their paid work adversely affected their university performance. And of course, 1 in 3 students were reported regularly missing university lectures or classes because of their need to work to sustain their studies. That's not how it should be. We should have a university system where people can go and enjoy studying, where they can actually learn properly, where they can attend the classes they are paying thousands and thousands of dollars for, where they can participate fully in the tutorials, which they are paying thousands of dollars for, and indeed which this parliament also pays thousands and thousands of dollars for. The university is absorbing the costs that we impose on them as a result of this legislation will result, as I said earlier, in reduced university staffing and services. And in this, I must acknowledge what the university sector itself has said about this bill. Universities Australia Chief Executive Katarina Jackson has described the government's approach to higher education funding as death by 1,000 cuts. That's the university sector's own description of this government's higher education policies. This piece of legislation is one of those 1,000 cuts. It's not building anything new and exciting for students. It's not making any investment in research. It's just one more fee. Last Saturday marked 6 years of the coalition government, and I said before, over that time we've had a huge decrease in investment and a huge decrease in participation in the vocational education and training space. We've also seen, unfortunately, an increase in casualised workforce in our universities. Universities are making redundancies. Permanent and fixed-term staff are facing the prospect of losing their jobs and being moved into more insecure and casual work. Analysis from the National Tertiary Education Union shows that approximately 8 out of 10 full-time equivalent teaching-only jobs are casual. That is, that we are saying we don't value teaching as much as we value research. Now, the reality is, for most of us who engage in the university sector, yes, we are lucky to have bright academics who make sure that we are learning from fabulous pieces of thoroughly assessed research. But teaching and learning is equally important. And if we continue to underfund our universities, we are going to continue to underfund that vital piece of teaching and learning that provides the workforce of the future that we so desperately need. Figures from the Department of Education and Training itself shows that now less than half of all jobs in our university sector are permanent. Less than half of the jobs in our university sector are permanent. That is a shocking statistic. Indeed, if you think about what this legislation does, it continues that trend of casualisation of our university workforce. We then look at what do universities do to fix the gap that this legislation leaves. What do? They turn to international students. A great export market, a fabulous thing that we share our universities with the world, and I'm so lucky that when I went to Curtin University, about 25% of the student cohort were indeed international students. It provides so much richness to campus life. It's richness to the university and to the tax coffers as well, some $35 billion contribution to the Australian economy, supporting some 240,000 jobs across the country. But it shouldn't be a substitute for proper funding of our universities because of just valuing them in and of themselves. The government must properly fund higher education and research in this country. I'm glad that we are properly scrutinising this legislation and making sure that students aren't disadvantaged by this policy. Indeed, in coming years, I hope that we do not have any reports of universities passing these costs on directly or indirectly to students. The member for Moreton spoke earlier of the alternate vision for higher education in this country. Indeed, Labor did take a $10 billion plan for universities over the next decade to make sure that we invested in the capital infrastructure and invest in the academic and mental infrastructure that's needed to make sure that our universities remain some of the best in the world. Sadly, and as I've acknowledged and many on the side have, Labor did not win that election, but it doesn't mean that we should be any less a voice for proper funding of our universities, proper investment in student learning, and I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Thank the member for Perth.